It began like any other boarding routine. Flight attendants giving safety demos, passengers scrolling through phones, and the soft hum of overhead bins slamming shut. But that peace shattered in row 18C. "Excuse me," a well-dressed woman said loudly, her voice tinged with visible disgust. "This seat isn't for people who smell like that." Her words cut through the cabin like glass, sharp enough to make heads turn. Sitting beside her was Harold Bennett, a quiet 76-year-old man with silver hair and trembling hands. On his lap, he clutched a faded cap embroidered with the words, "Vietnam Veteran, 1st Recon Unit." His eyes lowered. His shoulders sank. He said nothing. Passengers nearby shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. A young flight attendant arrived. "Sir, would you mind relocating to the back of the plane? We have available seating near the restrooms. It might be more suitable." Harold nodded slowly. He didn't argue, didn't protest, because for decades now, this was his reality, invisible in crowds, ignored in restaurants, and now being escorted away from his paid seat because someone couldn't stand the sin of old sweat, worn cotton, and maybe the faint trace of jungle memories he never left behind. Harold wasn't always just some old man. Once, he was Corporal Harold Bennett, a recon specialist during the Vietnam War. He crawled through dense jungle under sniper fire, rescued downed pilots, and once carried a wounded Marine 7 miles on foot. But Harold never bragged. No medals on his walls. No photos on social media. Just a faded cap and a photo in his wallet. His wife, Elaine, smiling in her wedding dress. She'd passed in 2015. Since then, Harold flew every month from Oregon to Florida just to sit by her grave, to talk to her, to tell her about his week. That flight today was just another part of his ritual. Until humiliation walked down the aisle in heels and perfume. Harold gathered his small carry-on and stood slowly, careful not to drop the cap now clenched tightly in his hand. He walked down the narrow aisle towards seat 32F, the one by the lavatory. The air around him shifted. Whispers, uncomfortable stares, the rustle of someone pulling their child closer. No one offered to help. No one offered kindness. The woman in 18B crossed her legs and smiled smugly, as if justice had been served. Harold sat down, shoulders hunched, and stared at the floor. The hum of the engines now seemed louder, almost mocking. The smell from the restroom drifted toward him, as if the world wanted to reinforce exactly where he belonged. But what Harold didn't know was that someone had been watching. A crew member, not a rookie, not someone fresh from customer service school, but a senior flight attendant named James Cortez, former Air Force Reserve. James had noticed the patch on Harold's duffel bag. He had seen the embroidery on the hat. And most of all, he had recognized the look in Harold's eyes, not of shame, but of forced silence. The kind veterans wear when the world has stopped caring who they were. James didn't say a word to Harold. Instead, he turned, walked calmly to the cockpit, and knocked. Inside sat Captain Elijah Rhodes, commercial airline pilot and former U.S. Army Ranger. Afghanistan, 2 tours. Bronze Star recipient. A man who also knew that look. "What is it?" the captain asked. James didn't hesitate. "Sir, we have a ghost walker in seat 32F, and someone just tried to bury him back there." Rhodes stood without a word, because this flight was about to take a turn no one on board would ever forget. The intercom buzzed. "Ladies and gentlemen," came the voice of Captain Elijah Rhodes, calm but firm, "we are making a brief stop on the tarmac due to an issue that requires immediate attention. Please remain seated." Murmurs rippled through the cabin. People glanced out the windows. Someone grumbled about missing a connection. But none of them knew what was really happening. The cockpit door opened. Captain Rhodes stepped into the aisle in full uniform, tall, composed, and carrying the quiet gravity of a man who had seen war and lived to respect those who had walked through hell beside him. But instead of walking toward first class or the crew, he headed straight down the aisle, toward the back. Passengers parted as he passed, unsure whether to move or simply watch. Phones were raised, some to film, some to text what looked like a mid-air emergency. But there was no emergency. There was a reckoning. When Rhodes reached row 32, he stopped and looked directly at Harold, who sat with his cap in his lap, confused and visibly shaken. "Mr. Harold Benson?" the captain asked. Harold looked up, unsure if he should respond. "Yes, sir," he said quietly. Captain Rhodes stood at attention. "Sir, my name is Captain Elijah Rhodes, U.S. Army Ranger, retired. And I want to thank you, not as your pilot, but as the son of a man whose life you saved." The cabin went dead silent. Rhodes continued. "My father, Staff Sergeant Marcus Rhodes, was part of the reconnaissance team caught in an ambush outside Da Nang. He told me the only reason he made it out was because a ghost walker found him. Said he never even heard you coming. Just felt an arm drag him to safety. Harold blinked. That mission had been over 40 years ago. He had no idea who the man was. He never did it for names. The pilot's voice broke just slightly. I was born 2 years later. If you hadn't been there, I wouldn't be here either. So I'd like to personally escort you to first class, if that's all right with you. Harold stood, slowly. Applause erupted. But Captain Rhodes raised a hand and turned to the cabin. Let me be clear. This man is not just a passenger. He is a hero, a man who saved lives. And today, I ask that we honor him not with pity, but with the respect long overdue. And then, in front of everyone, Captain Rhodes saluted Harold Benson. What began as humiliation had transformed into a moment that would restore dignity not just to one man, but to all those who had ever served silently and been forgotten. As Harold Benson followed Captain Rhodes toward the front of the plane, the clapping didn't stop. In fact, it grew. Row by row, passengers rose to their feet, forming a standing ovation that echoed down the narrow cabin. Not because someone told them to, but because for the first time, they saw Harold for who he really was. A man who had risked everything and asked for nothing. The woman from seat 14B sat frozen, her mouth tight, her fingers gripping her designer purse. She tried to catch Harold's eye, maybe to apologize, but it was too late. The moment had passed, and the cabin had made its choice. Harold was escorted to seat 1A, window side, where a fresh blanket and hot towel awaited him. A flight attendant carefully lifted his small bag into the overhead bin, then gently handed him a new cup of coffee, hot this time. I'm sorry, sir, she said, her voice trembling. For everything. Harold simply nodded, still overwhelmed. His cap rested on his lap once more, but now it wasn't a badge of shame, it was a symbol of honor. And the ripple effect didn't stop there. A young soldier in uniform stood from row 18 and made his way forward, snapping a perfect salute. Thank you for your service, sir, he said. An older woman in tears approached with a photo of her brother. He served in Vietnam too, she whispered. He didn't come home. Thank you for bringing others back. One by one, passengers filed forward. A businessman who had earlier chuckled under his breath now stood silently beside Harold and said, Sir, I misjudged you. I'm sorry, and I will never forget this. But the moment that struck Harold most deeply came from a little girl. She was maybe 6 years old, clinging to her mother's hand. She reached into her backpack and pulled out a small American flag pin. Her voice was barely audible over the hum of the plane. My daddy says heroes keep us safe, she said. Thank you for keeping us safe. Harold's hands trembled slightly as he accepted the pin. Thank you, sweetheart, he whispered, tears forming in his eyes. You just made an old man feel young again. And as the plane soared silently through the clouds, Harold Benson, the ghost walker of Vietnam, sat surrounded by warmth, gratitude, and the long-overdue recognition that had eluded him for decades. The flight continued, but something had changed. For Harold, and for everyone on board. As the plane descended toward Miami, the atmosphere inside the cabin felt transformed. What had begun as a routine flight filled with quiet stares and cold shoulders had become something altogether different, a shared reckoning, a collective awakening. Passengers weren't rushing to gather their bags or check their phones. They were watching Harold Benson, now seated in first class, not as an old man in a worn jacket, but as a living legend whose quiet presence reminded them all of what dignity, sacrifice, and courage really look like. Captain Rhodes returned to the intercom one final time before landing. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion, I want to thank you for the way you've shown respect today. We don't always get to witness these moments of truth, but when we do, we remember what kind of people we want to be. He paused, then added, If you've never heard the name Harold Benson before today, I promise, you won't forget it now. This man gave more to this country than most of us can imagine. And today, he reminded all of us that honor doesn't wear medals, it wears quiet scars and weathered hands. As the wheels touched down and the plane rolled to a stop, something unprecedented happened. No one stood. Not a single passenger moved. They waited until Harold Benson had collected his belongings, until he had slowly risen from his seat, until he had quietly made his way down the aisle, cap in hand. And as he walked, they clapped again. This time softer, steadier, like a long overdue thank you whispered by 150 strangers who had just seen a hero in their midst. At the gate, a small crowd had gathered, veterans, airline staff, and even local news. Captain Rhodes accompanied Harold all the way to the terminal doors. Before they parted, he leaned in and said, "Sir, my father always told me, real heroes don't need to speak, they just need to be seen. Today, they saw you." Harold looked out over the crowd, humbled and overwhelmed. "I didn't want any of this," he admitted. "I just wanted to visit my wife's grave." Rhodes smiled gently. "And you still will. But now, you'll go with the thanks of a nation."